everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Today is Not Tomorrow. Here with me, I have a brilliant woman who never fails to inspire me, Alliyah Logan. Hi, Alliyah.
Hi, Mofiyin. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Perfect. I am really looking forward to today's talk, continuing our theme, Letters to Self, which will involve you writing a letter to future you, sharing words of wisdom to me and everyone listening. So far, does this sound good?
Yes, that sounds great.
Perfect. We are in October and we are celebrating Black History Month. Therefore, today's discussion will be us digging a bit deeper to your experiences as a Black woman. Can you please start by telling everyone a bit about who you are, where you're from, and what it is that you get up to?
Well, thank you so much for asking me, Mofi. It's an honor to be here and sitting on your podcast and to everyone today. As you all know, my name is Alliyah Logan. I'm a Jamaican-American youth advocate from New York City. I am based in the United States, and I take pride in being a Black woman and my experiences in this world as a Black woman. So I do a lot of different work across a lot of different fields, and I like to focus on three main topics: international gender equality, which is where I got the chance to meet the amazing Mofiyin through Girl Up, which is an initiative through the United Nations Foundation, where I served as a 2019 through 2020 teen advisor. I also do a lot of work on reclaiming what safety means in communities. I'm sure you all have seen the protests that occurred this past summer with the Black Lives Matter movement and even the discussion of safety. So I work with Youth Over Guns, which is a student-led coalition and gun violence in Black and brown communities, to really redefine what safety means. And lastly, of course, I really work on education equity. And it's definitely weird doing this as a person outside of high school. So I'm a freshman, a first-year student in college now. So doing this work, being outside of the education, system, but being inside the private school system is very interesting. So those are the three main things I focus on. And of course, uplifting Black youth in those terms.
Alliyah, I started off by saying that you inspire me, and you do. We've heard just three of the main areas that you advocate for, and these three areas are so important, especially as a young Black woman: our gender equality rights, our educational equity rights, and gun violence, which I know is an unfortunately pressing matter where you are in America. Over the course of this podcast, we will touch upon these things. When was the first time, if you ever had such an experience, that you realized you are Black? When did you have that realization?
That's a great question. I think I'm often asked that question, but I can never pinpoint a specific memory or time where it was like, well, damn, I'm Black, And I think sometimes, and I always listen to interviews with different Black leaders from all political identities, where there's this common narrative, and I think I agree with it, where sometimes we like to paint Black people or paint ourselves as a victim within the system or a victim of these atrocities that occur. A lot of times when, in the American public school system, the only time you ever hear about Black narratives or even African American narratives is one is going back to slavery and back to being in enslavement. So for me, the first time, I think I've always known I was Black, but I've always taken pride in my Jamaican heritage. From a young age, I knew I was Jamaican. I knew I was Black. I knew I was a girl. These are identities I took pride in, but it was never like, oh, dang, I'm Black. It was like, well, I'm Black. Who wouldn't want to be a part of that identity? I was very proud and, very happy to be in my identity. And I think one thing about me is when I was way younger, I was very, very, enthusiastic and proud of my heritage and proud to learn more about the food I eat, the food my people eat, the history of our country back in Jamaica and even in America and all of those things. So I always taken pride in it, and I think I was always surrounded by people who look like me from a young age. When I went to elementary school, middle school, the areas that I went to school in, which I think is the education system in the UK is a little different when it comes to diversity, quote unquote diversity and such, diversity of race specifically. But in America, when you grow up in one area, you're usually around the people you look like. So I was around people who are Black and Hispanic majority of the time. So it was never a large battle in comparison to my Black counterparts that might have gone to, secondary school with predominantly white students. And that's a different story when you go to school with people you don't look like and having to go through that. But for me, from a young age, being surrounded by my culture 24/7, I was always proud of my culture, and I was always very happy to be a part of my identity.
I think it's great that as a young age you were able to understand and accept that who you are is amazing and take pride in your heritage and your ethnic background. Knowing this, was it because in your household were your parents also very vocal? Were they always exposing you to your roots and to a bit more of your background?
Yeah, I would say yes. I think I've always just known who I was. I never got a sat down talk about my heritage and what specific things mean, but even just being at family gatherings where you can just hear the way people speak and eat the food that your parents cook, and just different smaller things like that, and smaller interactions with your culture and your heritage, really make an impact. So
I know you touched upon going to school where you were always surrounded by people who were Black like you or Hispanic. I do remember we've discussed that you went to a school that was in your neighborhood, I think maybe for your primary school experience, and there was a time where you changed schools into a different neighborhood. Can you please just touch on what this experience was like and what the environments were like?
Yeah, so I believe secondary school for you all is high school. Is that correct? Or is that middle school? Wait, are you in secondary school now?
So secondary school is 11 to 18.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. You guys have the full range.
Yes.
So for my primary school and halfway into my secondary school, so for American education, it goes elementary school, middle school, and then high school. And then in the middle of secondary school is where you have middle school, and then the end of secondary school is where you have high school for the end of the 4 years. Okay. So it's kind of different, but very similar when it comes to the line that you go throughout your academic career. So for the beginning of my primary school, I went to school in my neighborhood. I actually ended up moving, but regardless of that, went to the same school, people who looked like me. The beginning of my secondary school, same situation. Now, the end of my secondary school, the end of my first section, which is middle school, I was basically everywhere in America every state has a different enrollment into high school, which is where it gets very interesting. And I'll say that every state has their own thing. Regardless, you have to go to high school. You have to finish your academic career, but not every school has the same resources. So I'm going to specifically talk about New York State and then the New York City entirely public school system when it comes to applying from middle school to high school. So when I was in middle school, your 8th grade year, you basically spend researching high schools, very similar to the college process, of course more condensed because you're just going to high school, but you just spend it researching, high schools, doing interviews, doing tests for specialized high schools and such, just to apply and enroll in those schools. So for me, the school in one of the high schools in my area wasn't as greatly funded as those in Lower Manhattan. Of course, Lower Manhattan is Soho, is tourist attractions, all that stuff. So they have obviously more resources when it comes to things like that. So in middle school, I kind of made the decision I definitely want to be in a new environment because I've been in the same environment in a way since elementary school and since pre-K. So I wanted to change my environment, and I also wanted to have more resources because I always saw how high schools in my area were treated or the connotation that it had. Mm-hmm. So usually the association was that the students weren't going to make it in life. The students weren't going to be successful. They were going to end up in jail. They were going to stay in poverty, whatever the case may be, which is not the case because the kids in my area and the kids in my community and people who are my peers are one of the smartest groups of people I have personally met. And I think it's just about having a lot of street smart, which is important. regardless of that, there's also this very American-based system of the school-to-prison pipeline, which I try to advocate against. So basically, the school-to-prison pipeline is funneling students from their classrooms into prison cells. And this comes in many different ways. But one of the things that comes in is having school resource officers, which is basically police officers for schools, and then also having metal detectors in schools. Metal detectors has a very interesting history, and I advise everyone who are interested in the American public school system to research it, because they weren't really implemented until after the Columbine High School massacre, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is a very American thing to have school shootings, to say the least. But basically, they were implemented to prevent school shootings. They were implemented to say, okay, if we have metal detectors, we can protect students, which is not always the case, because now, specifically in New York State, there is no research that shows metal detectors decrease violence or increase violence in schools. There's no correlation between an increase in metal detectors and a decrease in violence that occurs in schools. And there's also no research that provides how many schools have metal detectors in them, which is annoying because we're running into this problem where a lot of Black and brown schools and a lot of schools in low-income communities have metal detectors in comparison to schools in Lower Manhattan that are predominantly white who don't. So we're running into that problem when it comes to metal detectors. So for me, as a young person looking at that, I didn't want to be in those hostile environments where you felt like you were a prisoner in school. I wanted to be in an environment, that uplifted me and made me feel important in the classroom. I'm going to pause for a second and open my window. Hold on. I'm sorry, I was dying. But let me jump back in.
Good background.
Where was I at? Yeah.
Okay.
That was a lot of Black background, a lot. Let me jump back in. So as a young person, I wanted to be in an environment where I felt, comfortable, where I felt accepted, where it wasn't hostile, where, there wasn't school resource officers majority of schools actually have school resource officers, but I wanted to be in a school where, there was a good relationship with the school resource officers, which is one that I had, and they were fantastic people. Now, every student doesn't have that experience. So I ended up going to high school, all the way in Soho, which was a long commute. It was like, I don't know about your train system, but our train system is a mess. It was like an hour and a half commute from like my house to school, and then another hour and a half back, maybe an hour back, because it was rush hour when I was going home at like 3 or 4. So that it was a very interesting experience. And looking back on it, I'm very glad that I went to that school. And it's kind of a good thing that you get to choose where you go to school at. And where I'm at, you get to choose what schools you go to, if you go to public, charter, similarly to every other place in the world. And then you get to choose if you go to your zone schools or schools outside of your area, which is great. One of the most important things is ensuring that, no matter what school students go to, they shouldn't have to leave their communities to get quality resources and to get a quality education. This should be applied in every single school in our city, in our state, and around the country. Like, every single school should have, equitable resources. And when I say equitable resources, I mean like giving the community what they need. Because not every community needs the same thing. Not every community, of course, you're going to have the baseline of supplies and resources that you need for a school, but every community is faced with a different thing. Depending on the geographical location in America, different states might need different things. So it's very important to look at that. And I think, looking at my experiences is really why I started advocating in education and making sure that students were given the resources, that they deserved. And even now, looking at the Black Lives Matter protests a few months ago now, that started in June, but they're actually still going, that they are basically advocating for youth services in our communities and more services in our education system, because oftentimes we find that our schools have school resource officers, our schools have metal detectors, but our schools don't have nurses, our schools do not have counselors or psychologists to actually help with students' mental and physical needs. That was such a long answer.
No, it's okay. You've touched upon the protests that happened in summer, and before I dig a bit deeper into your answer, I just want to ask that you tell me a bit more about why you started to protest, why you attend protests. How do you feel when you attend protests? Does it empower you? Does it frighten you? What is the emotion that runs through you whilst you're protesting?
Great question. So yeah, I think we're living in a very, very interesting time. And I say this a lot, but it says a lot about America that so many people have to be out on the streets advocating for Black lives during a global pandemic, which I find very interesting that we had to take that route to be able to advocate for justice when it obviously wasn't as safe to do so in previous years. So for starters, being in a global pandemic was very difficult when doing this, and I wasn't able to protest as much as I wanted to because I did want to make sure that myself and my family were safe every day I came home from protest. So I didn't get to do as many protests as I wanted to throughout the days, but I'm very happy, and I was very happy to see so many people out in the streets advocating back to back to back to back to back within this like global pandemic, racial injustice, and an economic crisis. Still being out in the streets was very inspiring. So for me, I went to a few protests and I helped organize a few protests. One of the biggest ones was with the New York Justice League and a few other amazing organizations that we did in New York City. It was huge. It was in Union Square, for reference, and I think a lot of people were paying attention to that one because it was so many New Yorkers out in the street protesting. And then me and my friends had the chance to speak at it, which was great. But, being out in the street is so empowering. It is very, very tiring, to be walking for a long time period and like chanting and screaming. At the end of it, it's just an empowering experience to see people who look like you and see people who don't look like you advocating for your right. But I think it was more so the way I looked at it was advocating for human rights and human decency in America. And now even looking at the protests going to end as far as in Nigeria, there's so many parallels between what we were advocating for and what people around the world are still advocating for today. In the beginning of June, it was so amazing to see countries around the globe in every region protesting for Black lives and advocating for, justice for George Floyd, but also justice for Black people living within their country and their region. So it was a great experience, and it was extremely empowering to just see that I wasn't out on the street every day, but to look on social media and see so many videos of people protesting back to back to back in response to police brutality was really amazing to see and very empowering. And I will say this summer was a roller coaster of emotions. Like, it was very interesting, and I can only imagine how other Black youth felt. And I would love to hear how you felt, Black youth around the world seeing that, because there's so many parallels between what happened to George Floyd and what happened to Breonna Taylor and all of those stories of Black people just existing and living, being harmed by white supremacists or being harmed by police officers or whatever the case may be, whatever you want to classify it as. So many parallels, and I think that's one thing about being Black. No matter where you live, no matter your socioeconomic status, there's always some connection between these stories, and even if you disagree with them or you have a political identity, there's always some parallels within them. So it was a very interesting experience this summer. I think very transformative, and it's a push in the right direction when it comes to ending racism and dismantling anti-Blackness. But of course, more steps need to be taken along the way.
Definitely. I think as you saw me come in with my first question, there's a narrative of some sort of anger that I might still have within. Not a victimization, but anger. As you've asked, during this summer, seeing the protests, seeing the news and seeing the conversations that are held on social media have definitely encouraged us to keep talking about this and to keep moving forward. In regards to protests, you go out there and yes, you protest and yes, you're talking, and other than bodily fatigue, do you get tired? Do you feel like giving up? Do you feel protesting is worth it? I definitely do, but I wanna hear from you, considering you do it and you do it on such a large platform for hours on end, Alliyah, and it might be this weekend or next weekend, but you keep going. I want to hear about the will to continue.
Great question, because I've been questioning it too. I think, in the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in this summer, I like to think of them in eras where it first started with Trayvon Martin, and then the I Can't Breathe movement, and then now this summer. I kind of see it as a very long journey, and I think I see it from all the way back 400 years ago, way back when, during enslavement, where enslaved Africans were completely advocating for their liberation and for their freedom. And I see that as a long journey. And now this is our generation is taking the baton to really liberate Black people, not only in this country, but around the world. So for starters, that's how I see this, as a very long intergenerational movement of Black people advocating for human rights and human decency in this region and in this country. But I think sometimes it's hard not to say, when are we going to get what we've been advocating for? It's very difficult. And I think in the way that the American political system works, it's very hard to advocate for these things without being seen as radical or without being seen as crazy. When in reality, I don't see it as that. I see it as advocating for human rights and human decency, which is something that you'll hear me say a lot throughout this podcast, that term human rights and human decency, because that's how I see it. This is what this is about, literally advocating for our livelihood and what's most important to us, and making sure that people who look like us aren't discriminated, and moreover, that anyone in general doesn't have to have those experiences. So that's for starters. And I think for me, every single thing we do is a part of organizing. So a lot of times now, the election is coming up. I am wrong. The election is currently happening. There are people who are doing early voting, who are doing absentee voting. I'm voting the day of. Actually, that's exciting. And it's my first time doing so, but recognizing that voting is a form of organizing and protesting is a form of organizing. So I see this all as organizing and seeing how we can organize to advocate for ourselves. So I never really feel as though being out on the street doesn't work, because it does work. When you disrupt traffic, when you disrupt the regular day of people in power who are not paying attention to you, you are making them pay attention. Whereas if you're doing different things, it's very harder. It's easier for them to ignore you if you're doing different things. If you are, whether you're not voting or you're voting, it's easier for politicians to ignore you when you're not in their face, or when you're not in front of their office, or when you're not disrupting their street and being out on their street. So I always think of protesting as the most, if not the most important form of organizing that we have seen in this recent decades of young people getting out on the street. Is protesting is extremely important, but also looking at other forms of organizing as equally important. And I know I kind of contradicted myself when I said that, because I personally think protesting is, the most effective way of getting your voice heard. But there are also many other ways to do so. And one of them I mentioned is voting, is getting involved in that way. And I know a lot of young people are a little hesitant to vote, but you have to go down the ballot. This is just not a presidential election. This is a local election as well, where we're choosing our judges and even our district attorney. In the case of Breonna Taylor, you can choose your district attorney. You can choose those people in power to be able, to defend your livelihood in a sense. So that is very important for me. But I think I never get tired of protesting. I never think, damn, when is it going to be enough? Because truthfully, I don't think this is going to end with our generation. This is like an intergenerational movement where we're making it easier for future generations to accomplish what we have wanted. And I don't think this is going to be next year everything's solved, or in 5 years everything's solved, or in 10 years everything's solved, because it's impossible, in my opinion. This is definitely just an intergenerational movement where we're advocating to make sure future generations have those things that we may not have had.
I definitely agree with you. This is not going to be over by next year. It's unfortunate, but it is the reality that what is going on now is, as a member of Gen Z, we're paving the way and we're instilling hope and faith that in the future things will change. We will normalize what should be normal, i.e. equality, i.e. racism that doesn't exist anymore. Us going onto the streets to protest, getting Congress to change laws and voicing your opinion on global platforms, this is just the beginning. I definitely agree with you in that sense. And I know that my conversation points have definitely drifted, and that's because of my interest in our conversation so far. And I find it so important being on the other end of the pond, hearing about how you, as an American teenager, are tackling what's going on in your community, how you're not tired, and how you refuse to give up. These are all amazing things to hear of. Definitely want to hear from your point of view, how you see yourself. Alliyah, as a Black woman, what is the definition of a Black woman to you?
Great question. I'm over here shook. I'm like, dang. Wow. What is Black? I think, honestly, yeah. If I'm being honest, I think it's what you make of it. When it comes to being a Black woman, one of the things I love about us is we can do it all. And I say that as this is what I'm referencing, is like we can rock any hairstyle, any fashion style, any creative style. We can do that. I think that's just in our blood and in our bones. And when I say we do it all, is you can be whatever you want when you are a Black woman. It's not one cookie cutter definition of what a Black woman is supposed to be. And I think we've been taught that because we're a part of two different groups where you're facing sexism and racism and misogyny. At the intersection of sexism and racism is the misogyny in this country and around the world. When you're faced with that, it's very difficult to fit a standard because we're taught about what a woman is supposed to be. And then anytime we hear the word term woman, if it's not specific, we automatically think of the default as being a white woman, which is in its own a whole different conversation about how white women can show up more for Black women in the senses of racial justice and gender justice. But I think faced with two different stereotypes or ideas of what it means to be a proper woman in this world, what it means to be a woman where you're poised and like put together and all that stuff, which is great if you can fit those standards, but not all of us do fit those standards. And then we have what it means to be a Black person in America. Then you trickle down, and then what it means to be a Black woman in America and around the world. So I honestly think it's what you make of it. Like, there's no cookie cutter definition of what a Black woman is or how she should act or what she should be. It's really about just being authentically yourself. And sometimes I hate using the word authentically, but really just being confident in the way you look and the way you dress, which is a very difficult thing to do. And I say that because we often hear, just be confident with yourself. But it's hard to get to that place. So I would say being a Black woman is what you make of it. And honestly, the most important thing to do in your journey as a Black woman, accepting your Blackness and accepting your Black womanhood, is really about just taking time and being easy on yourself, because you're faced with a lot of things in this world. But it's very important to just be easy on yourself. Like, there's nothing else to say other than that. I think we're often given the strong Black woman stereotype where we're like, we have to be strong 24/7, which is great, but we're also able to be vulnerable and to be, and have all of our emotions, because we don't have to be strong or angry or whatever the case may be in one of those lives. We can be whatever we want to be. Being a Black woman is honestly just what you make of it.
Thank you, Alliyah. As you were talking, all I'm thinking about is how grateful I am to have someone like you, to have a teenager who advocates, to have a teenager who knows how to use her voice, who knows how to form her opinion, and who knows how to reach others on my podcast, because I feel like you're talking for all of us, on behalf of all of us. You're saying the things that we think about, but we don't know how to put together and say in words. And the definition that it's not even a definition, the way you try to piece together what being a Black woman is, it's an incomplete definition. That's what you've given us, because it's an incomplete being. We aren't one set thing, and I love that you've touched on that the way that you did. Everyone is different. They say that we should be strong. Some of us are strong as a normal human being, some of us aren't, and we find our ways of depicting those different versions of us, and that's what it means to be a woman. There is no definition. We are all different. I love your definition. I love the way you've tried to describe and piece together what being a black woman is to you. So thank you. I also want to touch on something that you've done recently. I was super impressed and proud of you for. You wrote an article for The Gothamist and it's entitled Hands Up, Don't Shoot. I read this. Please share to everyone what it was about and what were your inspirations.
Well, thank you. I mean, you just gassed me. What I said before wasn't even perfect. It was like scratched together. It's like so much cluster going on in my head. But yeah, that was a really great article that I recently wrote for the Gothamist. And that was really fun. That was like my first time actually writing something besides for different organizations for an actual news outlet, which was very exciting. But the Hands Up, Don't Shoot, it was a whole set of articles written by different young people. And I believe there were like 10 of us who wrote different articles in response to photos taken at the Black Lives Matter protest. So one of the photos that I had was a Black person standing on top of a gas station with their hands up. I personally think it's an amazing photo, and once you look at it, it's very transformative when you just stare at the photo, because it's like a clear sky. There's like one person just standing on a gas station, and from my understanding of it, I sort of dissected the meaning of it and what it meant to myself and what it meant to Black liberation and what it meant about this country and about the movement. But when I looked at it, I'm like, wow, there is a Black person standing alone, with their hands up. And obviously the Hands Up, Don't Shoot movement was basically about trying to react peacefully while someone else is escalating the situation when you don't have a weapon on you or whatever the case may be. So looking at that and seeing that picture, it just made me think about how we all can do our own part in advocating for an end to racism and dismantling anti-Blackness. And I mean that by saying we do our own part, but people who are non-Black need to pull their own weight more. Because oftentimes throughout history, it seemed as if ending racism was a thing that Black people had to do on their own. But specifically, Black women have to carry all of the weight for doing that and for ending anti-Blackness, just because of the narrative of being this strong Black woman and picking up all the slack for other people. The article was really directed towards Black people and towards non-Black people to say, well, Black people, we've done our work. We have been putting in the work to be ending racism and to be ending these forms of oppression, but we also need non-Black people to start picking up their slack. It is very important, and that's the only way to accomplish it, if other people of color and non-Black people in general are also advocating for Black people and advocating to end racism in those ways. So the Hands Up, Don't Shoot article was looking at it all. I was looking at history and seeing how this is just an intergenerational movement, but also looking at where do we go now and how can we also advocate for Black people.
I would definitely advise that if you haven't read Alliyah's article on The Gothamist, you do go and read it. When you feature on articles, Alliyah, like CNBC Make It, The New York Times, Teen Vogue, and takeover media platforms like UNICEF, just a few reputable outlets to name the least, do you feel like the good disruption you are causing is making sure that you are heard? Do you feel like your fight for cause is being recognized?
That's a great question. I think sometimes when I'm in an article or when I'm doing a takeover, whatever the case may be, I don't imagine it as only solely myself doing it. I see multiple perspectives in it because I'm from New York City, I'm from the Bronx, I am Caribbean, I am Black. I see all of those identities while I'm doing these things. So I think being a woman who wears many hats and has many identities within, I sort of feel it as a step in the right direction. Because if my perspective is being showcased, they're able to uplift my platform with such a large platform, whether it's journalists or different organizations. If they're able to uplift my platform, then they're uplifting the perspective of everyone in my identity. And of course, we don't all think the same, but even having someone who looks like me in the room is extremely important. And having someone who thinks the way I think or has the experience that I have in this world is very important. And I see this all the time, but ensuring that we're listening to all perspectives within this movement is very important to me. To be able to have worked with all of those different news outlets and organizations has been an amazing experience, because I don't see it solely as just myself in those articles. I see it representing my communities and my identities, making a step in the right direction, because it's all sort of smaller steps in this larger movement for human rights and human decency.
Your humility is astonishing, Alliyah, honestly. You do such great things, and I appreciate that you acknowledged it's not just you doing this, you are doing it on behalf of a collective of people. It might not be their name on the articles, but they helped you write this story. I find that extremely beautiful. I'm so glad that I've been able to talk to you, because I find all of the accomplishments and achievements that you have done and that I know you will go on to do, they are encouraging, and they are a reminder that as a member of youth, as a member of Gen Z, there is so much we can be doing. There is so much more to read into, to find out about. You are one of the many people who I look up to, in a sense that if I know something's going on and I don't know what I can do to make a difference, maybe reach out to Alliyah, see what she's doing about it, ask how can I help, ask for some direction. So thank you so much for sitting down with me. Thank you for being the woman that you are and continually inspiring me and many like me. Time is of the essence, and I honestly wish we could keep on talking and talking, which after the podcast I know we will, but please, I can only ask now that you write your letter to self.
Should I have a longer, should it be long or short? However I want.
However long you feel. However long
Got
you
it.
feel.
Okay. Dear Alliyah, I am sure you're working extremely hard to accomplish what you believe in and what you think is right. But it is always extremely important to listen to every perspective and to make sure that you're being as inclusive of people of different identities and different identities across the board, whether that is racial identity, gender identity, sexual identity, or even political identity, ensuring that you are the person that brings everyone into the room and makes sure everyone feels comfortable. I hope that you continue to put yourself first and to continue to care for yourself and advocate for yourself. And I'm very, very excited to see what you accomplish in your lifetime. Sincerely, or yours truly, Alliyah.
That was
and by the way, I do want to say, Mofiyin, you are brilliant. The way you speak, everything about you, the way you hold yourself. I mean, you're younger than me, and I think you are set for life. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Apologies that some of my answers were a little choppy,
No.
but hopefully you guys got the best of it.
Thank you for bringing you to the table, Alliyah. It's all I wanted, and it's what you gave me.